Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 130, The Birth of the Undead. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. How are you doing today, Mike?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well. Thank you. And what's new in your writing world?
Writing world, not too much. We're coming up on rainy season here, so I've been outside more, trying to enjoy the last days of sun that I might get for a while. For 6 months. I've been told it rains here a long time, so I've been out walking about on the beaches and the woods and stuff. So I've been mostly trying to enjoy that. I haven't done much writing. How's your writing going? I've actually been doing
something similar. Well, not much writing. Again, sort of managing life stuff. And I've been going out for walks as well to enjoy the changing color of the leaves. Because once that's over, then it's a long time of bare branches.
Yes.
It's been actually a beautiful show this year. Lots of color. Very, very pretty. Totally get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And what interesting stories have you found lately in books, movies, or television?
Let's see. I've been watching Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which we're going to discuss next time.
Yep.
I've been watching the beginnings of the last season, or the latest season of that. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a week.
Yep.
How about you?
The latest season, and I believe it's the last season of Ghosts, had premiered with its first episode. So I saw that, and still true to form, still looking good and a lot of fun.
Good.
And I watched the other day I thought it was a series, but it was actually a movie. The Thursday, I think it's Thursday Murder Club.
Oh,
it's
I haven't heard
British
of it.
Movie. I think it was on Netflix. British movie with Helen Mirren and Pierce Brosnan, and it's just a murder mystery.
Yeah,
it's sort of a who's who of who's been in Doctor Who.
That's funny.
But it was fun. Like I said, I thought it was a series when I turned it on, but it turned out it was a movie. But it was a lot of fun to watch. And I think they, just a relaxing kind of fun show to watch. And then inspired by Dracula, which is what we're talking about today, I started to watch a series on Netflix that was like a 3-episode Dracula series that was produced in 2020. I do not recommend it.
Oh.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into it too much, but I'll just say it was a gore fest that didn't stick with the story. And having just read the story, very familiar with it, and I'm like, what is this? And it wasn't even a good, if they redo it, because at first I thought, okay, they're redoing it and doing it from a different perspective, which is a clever way of taking a very famous story and sort of re-visualizing it, but there was no story. It just felt like it was just a gore fest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's too bad.
Anyway. Yeah. But whatever, you live and learn, right?
Yeah.
Recommend the Thursday Night Murder Club for anyone who's interested in sort of cozy kinds of murder mysteries. It was kind of cozy. And I'm not exactly sure what defines cozy versus non-cozy. I'm assuming it's cozy because the threat wasn't very significant, and it was mostly very, comfortable watching all the way through. It wasn't like you were in tension and suspense the whole time. So I'm assuming that's what a cozy is.
Yeah, I think so.
Are you ready to talk about Dracula, the book?
Yeah, let's do it.
Today we're talking about the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, and I will read the very short synopsis that comes up on Google that is from Wikipedia. Dracula is an 1897 Gothic horror novel by author Bram Stoker. The narrative is related through letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. It has no single protagonist and opens with solicitor, which is another word for a lawyer, Jonathan Harker taking a business trip to stay at the castle of a Transylvanian nobleman, Count Dracula. Did you enjoy this story?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was pretty cool. I had never read this before, and I didn't really know the full lore of Dracula. I'm really not a vampire person. I think vampires are pretty dumb generally, at least how they've been presented in stories. But this original source material is actually pretty good, I thought. It's very atmospheric. It does a great job of seating the reader in the world, making you feel like you're in that place, slowly building up tension. Yeah, I thought it works pretty well, and I liked the system that it was written in. I was a little worried that this approach of using letters and journal entries and newspaper articles would be a bit dry or distracting, but it's really not. I mean, it's kind of set up that way, but it's pretty much standard narration, really. It's sort of a gimmick, but it's the journal entries read like a lot of books read, so I think it's still fairly approachable and fairly easy to get into despite that. When I first started, the writing kind of reminded me of The Island of Dr. Moreau for some reason, which we discussed
Oh, yeah.
recently.
Okay.
Just had
It
this
is
sort of,
kind of contemporary with that.
yeah, it's around that same time period, so maybe that's why. And they're both these horror stories, and it kind of like builds up tension, slowly as you go, and then there's mysterious things that are happening which maybe you're not sure about. This kind of has a similar style, at least the beginning of it for me. Once I got into it, I was just kind of into the story. And like many horror stories, this isn't really so much about character growth. It's more about survival and defeating the bad guy, defeating evil, taking down evil. And I think it works from that perspective. I really liked the buildup of tension and eeriness in the first section with Jonathan Harker, where he goes to Dracula's castle, and then things are weird from the beginning, and they get more weird and more strange. And obviously, everybody knows about Dracula and vampires now, right? At least some understanding of, some familiarity with it. So we know what's going on. But it's still, I thought it worked pretty well, when you're seated in this other guy's point of view and seeing what he has to go through and seeing him figure it out. I thought they did it pretty good. And leading up to, his final act of going to try to deal with the situation, and it ends with his last journal entry, and we don't really know what happens after that.
Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah.
really good. And I was happy to see that he ended up making it through the story. I didn't know that. Like I said, I'm not super familiar with Dracula. So that was cool. And I think they do that a few times throughout the story. I think Bram Stoker does that a few times throughout the story, where he kind of sets the situation and then builds up tension, and then it leads to a climax. And I thought most of the time that works pretty well. I liked how at the beginning Count Dracula feels polite and hospitable. It's like, oh, this seems like a perfectly reasonable person here. But at the same time, you get that sense of something lurking beneath, right? Even upon that first meeting. And then, of course, the malice and the menace continue to grow. So I thought he did that really well. I also liked the Demeter section a lot, where they're on the ship.
Wasn't that good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where they're sailing and people are dropping one by one and they don't know what's going on. There's just a sense of dread and evil there. Stoker does a good job of really building up that tension and giving a nice feel of horror. Let's see, what else do I like? I mean, there's a lot here to like. I liked the reveal of Lucy being bitten. It's like, oh, she's out and about, and then there's these marks on her neck. And again, we know what that is, but obviously the characters are like, they're not steeped in the mythology necessarily. So they have to learn what's happening. And then again, a great sense of building up this dread with trying to save her and ultimately failing. But that whole section is like it's very tense and yeah, it's dark. It's very, very horrific. I don't read much horror, actually. I like watching a lot of horror, so this is kind of interesting to read a horror story. Let's see. Then, again, there's another buildup of tension when, after she dies, Van Helsing's trying to convince his friends realize what happened, and he takes them to the tomb to show them, and ultimately they have to build up a plan to finish her off so that she doesn't continue to be this vampire creature. I thought all that was really good. Overall, I thought there's a good style. I thought Stoker did a good job of giving each character their own voice. And to be fair, maybe part of that is because I listened to the audiobook with different actors reading the different parts. So that could help that. But even in the writing, you can tell that the characters were written different and written uniquely. So I appreciated that. Yeah, and then the whole part with Renfield, and you get the ominous feeling with him that something's building up, and then where he's begging to be released. You know something bad's going to happen. And again, it's a good use of dramatic irony because we know what's going on with Mina at the time, and she's being left alone, and you get the sense, I can kind of see where this is going to go. And of course, it does go there. And then I liked at the beginning of the last act where everyone knows what's going on, right? They're all fully in the know. They've read everything. They've all communicated with each other, and they're making plans to take out all of Dracula's coffins and finish him off. I thought that whole scene, that section was really good. And overall, I thought this could make a good movie. I think there's a lot that could be cut from this story to tighten it up for a movie, but sticking more to this story. I look to find a recent Dracula, and they all seem so different from this story. They seem to focus more on romance with the vampire, which doesn't exist in this story. Dracula's
No, it doesn't.
like entangled with anybody. He's just using them for blood. And in fact, it's the love between the other characters that helps them win out against Dracula. So I would like to see something more true to this story than these romanticized notion of vampires that we've gotten in the last 20, 30, 40 years.
I think you raise a really good point there because I think a lot of times they're trying to make the vampire be a little bit sympathetic to some degree. Otherwise, it's the story of taking down a man-eater tiger or something, right?
Yeah.
Which is referenced in the book.
Right.
But I think Mina did what was necessary to help humanize him by saying he needs compassion in the same way that if I turn into a vampire, I'm going to need compassion.
Yeah, I thought that was great.
I thought it was great too. And so I think that would be the way to, because Stoker already built it in. So for a movie, that's the angle on keeping Dracula humanized a bit, even while you're taking him down.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would love to see that because you give some depth to the characters. Then it's not just,
yeah,
here comes the evil. We have to kill the evil. We killed the evil. Done.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Putting that human element to it would be nice.
So like you, I loved the atmosphere of this story. And we have for Halloween now for a couple of years looked at scary stories. We've looked at Poe, and we did a whole series of Poe short stories and Poe poetry, and we've, like you talked about, we did the Island of Dr. Moreau. And have we done anything else scary from this era? I feel like there was something else from this era that we read. I think that's it. This is by far my favorite. I, like you, really, really enjoyed the slow buildup. I wrote down, this was like walking into a mist that becomes a fog, and you get lost before you even realize that you're lost. That's how it feels.
Yeah, I like that.
And it's the slow buildup. You just get these little hints. There's this comment that I remember from very early in the story about there's a horseshoe of area in this, there's a horseshoe of space, a horseshoe of neighborhood, so to speak, in this area of the Carpathians in Transylvania that is like the epicenter of superstition. I'm paraphrasing what the line was in the book. I don't remember the exact line, but that was what, right at the very beginning, there's like, they start hinting a little bit about superstition, and
Yeah.
then you get a little bit more superstition, you get superstitious behavior, then you get very strange behavior from the count, and it gets more and more strange until you're hip deep in this terrible gothic, terrifying experience for Jonathan Harker. And I think that was wonderful. And Bram Stoker did that throughout. Right? You get the same thing in Whitby. You start off Whitby and it's all very nice, and then it gets slowly but surely more spooky and more spooky and spooky. And then you start off in London and it's all very fine, and it gets slowly more spooky and spooky and spooky. Even the story of the Demeter is a microcosm of the same style. Starts off normal and then gets spookier and spookier and spookier. And I think that's just a brilliant way of doing it over and over and over again throughout the story. It just really creates that atmosphere amazingly.
Yeah.
I've been to Whitby, and I have seen the ruin of the abbey there that is supposed to have inspired this story. It is delightfully gothic. I mean, it's just, the whole area is really cool. I've walked up those steps that, Mina talks about, and I've been in that cemetery that she and Lucy sat in and watched the water. I could visualize the storm coming into the harbor and the ship floating in. I mean, it was just really cool. So having that extra layer also made it really amazing for me for an experience. As I too listened to it as an audiobook instead of reading it. I actually found it a little difficult to read the journals, etc. And so to me, it became easier to listen to it as an audiobook. So that's what I did. So it was really cool to listen to it and visualize those locations in my head. So that was really neat. The other thing that I actually really enjoyed about this was this tension with the folklore and the superstition and science, and how it was eventually resolved by applying the folklore in a scientific way to solve the problem. I thought that was really cool, because you had these people of science, these modern people for whom this kind of superstitious knowledge had no value, right? Jonathan Harker was like he wasn't rude to the people who were superstitious, but he definitely was sort of like, I have knowledge that you don't have, so therefore I'm not going to buy into what you are talking about. When in reality, it was the other way around. They had knowledge he didn't have.
Yes.
And Van Helsing actually brought all that together and merged the two. And I'm sure there's some kind of thematic lesson there. I'll have to think about what I think that is. But that's one of the things I thought was very interesting. How, Dr. Seward, right, and his study of the insane and very much focusing on science. And yet the real solution here was this blend of science and folklore to really understand what was going on. I thought that was a very interesting take.
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought the Van Helsing character was great. I think because of what you said, largely, it's like he's obviously a very competent scientist and doctor, but he's open-minded and sees these other aspects of maybe what were mythology or the occult or whatever, and he's willing to test them and see if that's correct. It's like he doesn't just immediately jump to that conclusion. He says, "Oh, I've heard of something like this before," and then he investigates and realizes, "Yeah, maybe there's something to this." And then more and more and more, he realizes he's correct. That was really well done.
And in a way, he kind of embodies that quote from Sherlock Holmes about whenever you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, which is actually true scientific evaluation. You don't make assumptions. You're like, okay, if this doesn't make sense, then we need to look at what doesn't seem likely, but may be possible. I think that's really cool. The other thing that I really enjoyed was that Mina, as the primary female character here, was actually sort of, even though the description that I just read from Wikipedia says that there isn't a single protagonist, she was kind of the hero of the story. And especially when you look at the very last entry about how brave she was and how everything was because of her. And I thought that was a really interesting take as well. You don't usually see that, or at least I'm not an expert on late 19th century literature, but my sense is you don't usually see that.
I enjoyed this novel now. I think for the time, this would have been great. You wouldn't have had, like right now, it's like we know so much and little pieces, bits and pieces, and there's just so much lore and this kind of horror and Draculas and vampires and all these things. It's so known. And back then, while they had vampires in their mythology, there had never been a breakout, right? There had never been a Dracula. Like Dracula sort of set the tone for everything to come that we all know now. So as
Right.
as the first big story to come out like this would have been great at the time.
So we like this story.
Yep.
Is there anything we might have changed as an author?
There are a number of things that I would have done differently. To be fair, some of this is just, modern writing. We're now well over
Oh, yeah.
100 years after this was written. So a lot of this is not really fair. And also just different story structures and things that, types of stories that we like to read, not types, pacing and things like that. Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
one thing I obviously wouldn't put so much inherent and subtle sexism into the writing that was here. I don't necessarily think that Bram Stoker did that intentionally.
Yeah.
It's just, the way people thought at the times. Things like
Exactly.
she has a man's brain and a woman's heart. It's like that's a weird thing to say now. And there's a lot of that sprinkled throughout, but you can look past that. I don't think it was anything mean spirited in this.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So another thing, like a specific thing that stood out to me as I was reading it, they had just gone through all this work trying to save poor Lucy being drained from blood, right, and dealing with all that trauma, and then Jonathan doesn't connect this to his wife becoming paler and weaker every night. that seemed a little
Yeah.
silly almost,
Yeah.
given the horror of what they just gone through. It seemed like he would be so super sensitive to that as soon as she was pale, he would be immediately panicked. So that's something that I would have changed. I would have
Yeah.
had them connect the dots much more quickly there. And it
Yeah.
really wouldn't have affected the story. While the letter approach was interesting, what do they call it? Epistolary? Is that what this is called? Something like that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That approach at times lacked narrative drive. Like, let's give the characters goals that they're working toward. Because when they did that, like when it's like, okay, Van Helsing is going to show them what's going on with Lucy, that she's the undead now, and then they're going to come up with a plan to finish that problem. And then when they're going to go and get all the coffins and sanctify them, like those moments were far more intense for me and far more present because they had a goal and they had actions and they were doing something specifically. I would have liked a little bit more of that. I don't think it was necessary throughout, because I think he does a good job of, like we talked about before, setting the atmosphere and building up the tension and things like that. I think there's moments where you don't necessarily need that. I thought the opening with Harker was really good. And then, it built to Harker taking action and having some proactivity. So I think there's a lot of sequences where he does do that, but there's some lulls where he doesn't. So I would have just amped that up a little bit more. Let's see. There were a number of sequences that were just too long for me as a modern reader, like Lucy dying. Like, how many times did they have to transfuse blood into her? You kind of get it. I think that could have been shortened a bit. Good in its build-up and sense of impending doom, but it could have been half as long. And another thing for me was, and this is probably one of my bigger complaints, was the final act. It went on way too long. There was so much what some other writers have referred to as shoe leather in the final act, which is just like getting you from place A to place B. So much
Oh, interesting.
traveling.
I've never heard that phrase before. I like it.
Yeah, and there's just so much traveling, and we needed some cutting there. needed to get us back to the story. It kind of lost a lot of the tension it built up. I think it was trying to build tension, and for me, it just kind of drained it, because it's like, okay, we're now another day of traveling at the sea, and she's hearing, or are traveling on the roads, and she's hearing water lapping against the boat, And then another day of that, and another day of that, and another day of that. It's like, okay, I get it. You're traveling a long distance. I don't need to hear every single day of that. So I would have tightened that up a lot. And then I thought the climax was kind of weak, especially the actual killing of Dracula. I would have liked to have given each of our heroes something specific to do so that they play a very specific part and they have a role. Especially Mina, because like you said, she's kind of one of the main characters of this story. I would have liked to see her do something specific. We got to see her sort of stand up to the three women, which was nice, but I would have liked to have seen some interaction with Dracula, who had caused this woe for her. And I would have liked to have seen Dracula give us one last show of strength, maybe calling in, creatures to attack the heroes or something, because it felt like, okay, he's there, we roll him out of the coffin, we kill him, he's dead. It's like, it just felt very anticlimactic to me. The stuff
Yeah.
leading up to that was more interesting with the women, his three women minions who were in his castle. That was more interesting. So I would have liked to have that climax have a bit more punch. What about you? What do you agree with any of this, and what would you improve, if anything?
I agree with you 100%. And I have very similar notes because of that. Though I will say, when I was listening to the climax, I was still on the edge of my seat, even though I knew what was going to happen. So I was invested enough that it worked for me. I can totally see what you're saying about how it would have been nice to see each one of these characters. Though in retrospect, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about that. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when the undeadifying of Lucy took place, that was Van Helsing and Dr. Seward and Arthur. And then, so it made sense that it would be Jonathan and Quincy who undeadified Dracula, because the other two had already done that. So I think it kind of spread out the heroicism.
Yeah, I can see that.
And maybe that was important, a sort of a culturally important thing at the time, that
Oh yeah, maybe.
everybody takes action. I don't know.
And they gave
But
Mina
that was
her
the one thing I
role
saw.
with the three women, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, having her shoot a gun, I didn't expect that to happen, and it didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, Star Trek wouldn't even let the women fire phasers for 6 seasons. So I had other very similar concerns. And in the same way that you said, why wouldn't Jonathan be much more attuned to the fact that Mina is getting pale? I thought there was an overall lack of basic human curiosity. When Van Helsing would say something oblique and
Yeah.
mystifying, they didn't say, "What are you talking about? Just cough it up. We already know there's vampires. There's all this stuff happening. Just tell us what's going on." And he would always be like, "No, I can't tell you." So I
Yeah.
also, I mean, to me, I was like, and that happened over and over again. And I think that's a stylistic thing. And maybe it is also a cultural thing. But for now, in my 20th century, 21st century viewpoint, to me, I was sort of like, you people need to ask a lot more questions, especially if you're scared. When you're scared, you want to know answers. And so that sort of felt a little untrue to me.
Right. It's like spit it out. It felt a
Yeah.
bit like how in romance stories, it's like all this conflict would be resolved if you just had a simple conversation.
Yes.
So it felt
Yes.
kind of
Thank
like
you.
that.
Yeah. And similarly, I felt that Van Helsing talked too much without saying anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there sometimes it was really fascinating, and sometimes it was just talking, and saying the same thing 3 or 4 times. And I was like, oh yeah, you've said that 3 times now without actually saying anything. You haven't communicated any additional new information. So that was sometimes a little annoying. I would have liked to have some of the questions answered. At the very beginning of the book, they're traveling through the woods of Transylvania, and there's blue lights. What are the blue lights? I don't think we ever got an answer. Maybe we did and I just don't remember, but I don't think we got an answer. But the biggest question for me is, what's the story about Renfield? How he's supposed to be insane. He's in the asylum. What was his connection to Dracula? How did he know Dracula was there? What, how, I don't think it was ever explained, other than he's crazy, how he knew that Dracula was his master. If this is the first time Dracula's ever come to England, what is the connection? I don't think that was ever explained. Did I miss it?
I don't think so. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I had kind of assumed earlier on that Dracula had just gone there and, was using Renfield basically. So they had kind of met there, but maybe there had been some type of correspondence or something earlier. That's a good
Yeah.
point. I
I
don't
mean,
know.
and that's fine, but we had to infer there was a
Yeah,
connection there. It wasn't really ever explained.
yeah, that's true.
And there was only one other thing that stood out to me as something that I would have changed as a writer, and that was that throughout this story, the violence perpetrated on all the victims is very abstract. You don't see a whole lot of detail, except for Mina's attack when she's forced to become a vampire. And then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
it's very detailed. And that was, to me, inconsistent with the feeling of the rest of the story. It took it from atmospheric gothic horror to pure graphic horror. And I was like, oh, I didn't care for that. I think it would have been to keep consistent with the sort of feel of the story. I think they could have described the end results of that and then had Van Helsing, oh my gosh, this is what happened. And, his draw a deep breath and have to explain that, now she's been indoctrinated into the Dracula fan club. It was too graphic for the rest of the story.
That's an interesting note because you're right. Up to that point, I was thinking, I don't really see anything happening in this story. Like
Yes.
it's all kind of off screen. It's
Yeah.
all, it's like we're not actually seeing Dracula do much. We talk to Jonathan Harker at the beginning and we get this foreboding sense that stuff is happening. We know he's doing stuff, but you're never actually getting a scene of that. And you're right. And then it's like, then you get that scene. It's like, oh, okay, there it is. I think some of that, having watched a bunch of horror and thought about it a little bit, it's actually a kind of common thing in horror. And this is obviously one of the earlier ones, so maybe it sort of set the trend. But a common thing in horror is you don't see the monster, right? Let's just call it generically that, at the start, and then you slowly see little bits more and more of that thing until a reveal later in the story. So this kind of does that in that sense. It's like you don't get to see the actual horrific thing until much later in the story. So yeah, it's interesting that you pointed that out. I agree. I don't know that it was necessary for this, but I could see how it would amp up the horror, especially for people reading this, 125 years ago.
That would have been shocking, I
Yeah.
would think. Yeah. Interesting. But that was it. Other than that, I really enjoyed the slow buildup and sort of the atmospheric feeling of it.
Yeah, I agree. This was a lot better than I was expecting it to be.
So did you come up with any themes for Dracula?
Oh. Usually, I like to do themes based on the character transformation over the course of a story. This is not really one of those stories. Most horror stories aren't, at least from what I can think of. So what I came up with is a group of determined people with strength of heart can overcome any evil.
Oh, I like that.
What did you come
I
up with?
I had a couple of them. I noted that there was, it kind of highlighted the value of courage of all kinds because there were different kinds of courages
Yeah.
presented here, but also the value of giving of one's gifts to accomplish a goal. Because each one of them brought their own skills to the table. And each one of those skills, in a sort of a more subtle way than we usually see, helped accomplish the goal, right? So
Yeah,
Dr.
that's
Seward
true.
and his medical knowledge, Van Helsing and his folklore knowledge, Arthur and his money, Quincy and his hunting skills, Jonathan and his legal skills, and his love for Mina, Mina and her journaling and writing and stenography and organizing skills. And so everybody kind of brought something to the table here in a more subtle way than we usually see, but they still managed to contribute to the overall goal.
I like it.
So what do you take away from Dracula as a writer?
My takeaway is don't be afraid to take the time to immerse the reader in the setting and, if
I like
necessary,
that.
to build dread or tension for what's to come.
Nice. Mine is very similar. I have the value of the slow buildup.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us as we talked about Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. A huge thanks to our Patreon supporters and all of our listeners. Your support, even through a simple like or share, means the world to us. If you enjoyed today's themes, check out E.W. Barnes's Empyrean Guard Space Opera, currently in draft on Patreon. It features interstellar missions, fractured allegiances, and characters caught between galaxy-wide conflict and loyalty to their team. The link is in the show notes if you're curious to explore more.
The Stories Told podcast is on all major platforms. Please like, subscribe, or follow to help us reach more story lovers like you. For book, TV, or movie suggestions, drop a note on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes as well. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com. Join us next time as we talk about the story told in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.